everyone in the call. I really appreciate that you guys are here. As you guys know, we do a monthly lunch and learn, and with the objective, effectively, we want to share insights, but we not only want to stay with the insights, we want to get your insights, because we want to learn as much from you as you can learn from us. For this episode of our lunch and learn, PJ and I have been talking for, I think, the last year a lot. A lot of the things we have been talking about were our creative minds, out of the box, our thinkings, etc. But one thing came out of that is the fact that if you look at strategy within organizations, we see in general that when we start building a strategy, we look at what is our products, who are our customers, how do they value our solutions, how can we find new ways of going to market, what are the results we are looking at, how can we improve that? And that's all fine. We all know that. It's a corporate strategy. We go for it. You know, the big town halls, big town hall within your company, your executive comes in, all your leaders present back, this is the strategy. But most strategies fail. I think 90% of the strategies fail. A few years ago, it was 90%, maybe now it's a bit less. And one of the things we see over the years is that if your organization is not ready to adopt towards a strategy, if they don't believe, if they don't trust, if they don't feel confident with the new, nothing changes. So PJ popped up with a really good thing that I think Peter Drucker said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, today I'm going to give the word to PJ. He's going to run the show today, and he's going to share some perspectives from his thinking, his experience regarding culture and how it can fuel your growth or make your organization. PJ.
Thanks, everyone. Rahim, Wendy, it's lovely to have this conversation, because and let's call it a conversation, right? It's not just a presentation, it's a conversation around this. But this notion of culture, particularly over the last couple of years, I think perhaps it's become intensified, and it's moved up the C-suite agenda. In fact, I think in 2020, Forbes referred to it now as the year of workplace culture. But you know, I mean, culture is with us all the time, whether we like it or not. We have a culture. Your business has a culture. Now, it may be by default versus by design, but I would say to people, listen, don't get upset about it. There just is one all the time. So you have to understand, is it serving you well or is it not? Does it work for you? Does it not? And a couple of weeks ago, when Rahim and I were having, relatively heated buddy conversation about this, is why does culture matter so much? And if it does matter so much, why aren't we attending to it? Was that fair, Rahim? I think that was quite an important point.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. That's fair, because it is a challenge. You and I both work for smaller organizations, but also for the bigger ones. And you do see that those changes come in really rapid. Quick changes in the market, quick changes in product, quick changes in everything they do. But sometimes we get stale because it's again another change. Sometimes we get stale because there's not a real mission where people believe in. And that culture is a driver, because if your people don't believe in what you do, forget about your strategy.
But it's interesting you say, because you mentioned good old Pete Drucker's model. I don't know if it's 40 years old or 50 years old, but it's a good reference point, I think, just to kind of talk to. And and the 3 points of the triangle, when we just think about them, strategy, culture, and leadership, they are all linked. You can write the best strategy in the world. Leaders, really, actually, you've got two jobs, leaders. Number one is, yes, you do have to prepare that strategy. You do have to be concerned with governance, finance, sales, and those processes and procedures and so on. But leaders also need to behave in a way that creates a culture that enables people to be at their best and therefore deliver that strategy or mission or vision or whatever we want to call it. You can write the best strategy in the world as leaders, but if people aren't engaged with it or signed up to it or don't feel engaged or enabled to deliver it, then say the best strategy in the world will not get delivered if your culture doesn't support it. Of course, conversely, we also need a strategy to develop our culture, perhaps is what we're going to talk about a little bit today. But I don't know, what do you guys think about that? Do you agree or disagree? Does culture eat strategy for breakfast, or is it more important that we have a strategy to deliver our culture? I'd be interested.
Yeah, out of experience, I would say this is absolutely true. I've seen in many occasions some pretty nifty strategies going to pieces, just because the day-to-day behavior of the starting with the C-suite team, which is generally where things need to start and give example. If that doesn't function with a value set that people are comfortable with, then you don't get very collaborative behavior, and you certainly don't get a lot of motivation. What I found about corporate culture is that a positive corporate culture is often undervalued, also by the teams downstream. And it's only by the time that the corporate culture becomes negative that people start raising hands and start leaving and voting with their feet, rather than sort of valuing the positive corporate cultures, right? So it's like a good corporate culture is like a given. It's a minimum must-have, and it's not in my experience, especially in larger organizations, not that much valued. Also in larger organizations, the direction needs to come from the top. But if your immediate managers involved in implementing the strategy are not signing up for the strategy, or most importantly for the culture that is needed for that strategy, then I think you're pretty chanceless with your big plans.
That guys, so it's often the disconnect between the ambition of the organization versus the understanding, the belief that that vision is the right one, and that translation. I'm in change management. I always work with executive teams, looking at the communication, looking at the people, and often the communication is one-sided. We go there, we do that, etc., etc. But it's not like we get people involved and get them to own that strategy. So the key question, PJ, is I think that's something we should look at is, if you look at company culture, if you look at strategy, if you look at your organization, I always wonder, what are the key items we can do to make that, to change the company culture to fit the strategy versus the strategy fitting the company culture?
So if we think first, like, when we talk about culture, what do we actually mean by it? Because I work with lots of companies on this, and some people, for example, get confused between culture and engagement. So let's just quickly just define that, if we may, and then we'll move on. Engagement is about the individual engagement with the business, training, development, rewards, pay, and so on. Culture is about we. It's about the day-to-day, how we get things done. The culture guides, it guides us, it guides the workforce. It's about the way we make decisions. It's about the way we problem solve. It's about productivity. So culture, and I guess its simplest term or simplest form is the way things get done around here. It's the way things are around here. And just to Dan's point quickly, if I may, I was at a conference a week or 10 days ago, and 5, 6 execs gave these wonderful presentations to many people, and I was actually sat near somebody and they said, that's absolutely great, but it'll never happen. And there's your culture bit. That's great, but we're disconnected from it. So when it comes to culture, I think is to define what you want that culture to be, as Rahim was just saying, linked to the strategy. So here's the strategy. What do we need to be doing and saying to bring that to life? And understanding what your current culture is. And it's things like, how do decisions, this is a really good one, by the way, how do decisions get made round here? Do we feel, our staff part of those things? Do we give staff or employees problems to solve, or do we give them tasks to do? So very often it will be around things like, say, decision making, looking at behaviors. Dan was saying leadership behaviors. You're looking for 5, 6, 7 keys probably. And so when people say, well, what actually is it? If you could get some litmus, it's worth thinking about. Remember the old litmus paper at school, 5 or 6 litmus tests or litmus paper, and dip them in the culture. You don't need many, you don't need sort of many tests, but I would certainly look around things like psychological safety. How able am I to say what I think and feel? That's a good one. Behaviors I've mentioned before. How we manage conflict, or how we manage poor performance isn't how do we, no, not just how do we manage poor performance? Can we have difficult conversations? Do I feel safe? So these are broad, these are broad ones, but they're really good indicators. So you might go into a business, and I'll talk about, Rahim mentioned it just now, collaborative culture. The business will say it has collaborative culture, but when you go and talk to individuals and you do some interviews, they'll say we don't. Right? It's a nice to have, but we don't actually do it. And so you want to be measuring. In order to understand current culture, measure what you actually want to measure. And most people, by the way, don't. They use an old engagement survey to measure culture. Therefore, you're measuring engagement. You're not measuring culture. So if you look at the strategy, it's what do we need to look like in the future? For example, look at the strategy. What do we need to be doing? How do we need to be behaving? Where are we now? What do we need to improve? What changes do we need to make? And many of those will be on a culture basis. For example, how quickly we make decisions. There you go. Rahim, does that help? Oh, you've gone on mute. Somehow, Rahim, you've gone on mute.
I was putting myself on mute because I loved your explanation. No, but effectively, I do agree with you. There are a lot of elements, moving elements within organizations. I think still the challenge is we know that, or we tend to know that. If you read the articles, everything, you tend to know that. But if you bring it to real practice, it's a different story. It's a real different story. I have conversations with my clients where we have a mission, we have a vision, we have a purpose. Everything looks beautiful. Like you say, you talk to the operational people, they don't have a clue. They really don't have a clue. So it's about how do we get it through that organization, dribbling down, and maybe even vice versa. How do we basically spray up, I don't know how you call it, but go up the ladder and get that culture embedded. Dan, you have a question or a contribution?
Rather common, maybe. I thought PJ mentioned an interesting word a couple of times. If the people feel safe to raise their hand, to discuss things, and at the end, what seems to me is that you can have a whole set of values of very sort of universally accepted good things to do, right? And being collaborative, being empathetic, show respect. It's hard to argue that those things wouldn't contribute, and it's hard for anyone to argue that you shouldn't stay there. But at the end, I think it's about how much the people trust that these values are actually pursued. And it is when especially management starts showing that those values are more on paper than in reality. Trust is lost. And and I think within leadership, you can have knowledge, you can have leader capacity, you can be good in delegating, whatever you want. But if you can't create trust, you're toast.
Good point. Good point.
I love that. Actually, I'm thinking about actually those similarities with culture and trust. I mean, let's consider culture just as trust. It takes a long time to build trust. It can be broken very easily. And, it's even harder to kind of change it. But it is that very personal connection. To what degree do I feel safe? Do we trust each other? And then you kind of notice then if you take that as perhaps a determining factor down, and then you apply it to other things like, say communication or ideas. We want a culture where people, share ideas. Okay, that's a great idea. That's a nice to have. But do I trust you as my boss? Do we as a team have enough trust or trustworthiness where I will share my idea? Because it might be a bonkers idea. But if you get 2 or 3 good ideas together and you make connections, you might get something very special. But if I don't feel there's an environment of trust, I'm less likely to share my idea, for example, in case I get teased, which means that great idea disappears into the ether. But if we can create trust, and then we perhaps can create a place to store those good ideas, we may start making connections, and then all of a sudden something magical happens. So trust, like culture, absolutely at the heart of it.
I like actually the storage part. I actually like that, because to be honest, when we get into organizations and they ask us to help us with their change programs, what do we hear? Basically, in 99% of the case, now I'm going to exaggerate. Let's say 90%, 80%, doesn't matter. In most of the cases, we tried that, we done that.
Yeah,
it was never executed, and now we're going to try something else. So that storage of what happened, but also storage of concepts of ideas. Call it the gift box. I call it the gift box. There's a gift box there, and we're not touching it. But at a certain point, that gift box, we open it, and there are some special gifts in there. Things we haven't done in the past, but things we may apply in the future. I often hear, that's too far away. That's all the future. We can't do that right now. Then I'm asking a question, but if we can't do it right now, how are we going to get there? So how do we get to the position that we can actually do that in the future? Because the fact we can't do it now doesn't mean we cannot do it at all. It's just, how do we as a team get to the point that we can do it? Yeah? Let's open that gift.
And I love the idea of a gift box, but connecting those gifts, I also think it's really important. So, you know, I was chatting to a chum the other day, actually, and he said, you know, his definition of success is connecting 2 things previously unconnected. So if you open that gift box and you might take one out and you start connecting them a little bit like building blocks. In isolation, they're nice to haves. You connect 2 or 3 together, and sometimes you get something very, very special indeed. But people have got to have, I think in my view, got to have better if they have the trustworthiness, you know, in the culture to enable them to share that gift. And think on a very practical level, for example, some of the teams who are quite good at it are some of the Formula One race teams, or they say, let's have some great ideas to make the car go faster. Then they will choose one that perhaps they can implement within budget or implement one within time. It doesn't mean they throw those other ideas away. They keep them, you know, for next week or next month, and they might combine or they might change them a little, develop them a little bit, but they stay there. They don't throw things away. And I suspect sometimes in business we throw away those things too much, or worse, we don't create an environment where people feel safe to share them. And just quickly, just go back to Dan's point, if I can, just something about the value of culture. Just some numbers. When we think about it, I was in a meeting September, October last year, and we were talking about the reasons why it's worth paying attention to culture. And somebody, one of the board, fascinated, said, "Oh yes, I read a PwC report that said if we pay attention to culture, we'll get a 12% increase in profit," or something I can't remember. And all nods around the table, yes, 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 do that. And you think that's great, but it is for the wrong reason. You know, you're going after the number first. And that might be driver for you, but it won't be for the other 1,200 people in the organization. But I wrote down just before I came on a couple of other numbers, and I just thought I'd share. These are from real people. So when you get your culture right, when you improve your culture, I'm just going to read a couple out to you just quickly. They've had an increase in share price, revenue increase, 10% increase in customer metrics, 19% increase in operating profits, 70% improvement in quality of hires, 59% improvement in lower attrition rates. These are from different people. But here's one just to make you smile. 69%, this is not mine actually, this is somebody else's stat, but 69% of employees do not believe in the current definition of their own organization's workplace culture. And that, Rahim, is what you're saying earlier. That's because it's come down. We've stated it. So when we work with a company to say, let's understand the current culture, define the future culture, we run just three things. Firstly, we go and interview people individually, so they have the safety, the psychological safety to talk to us anonymously and to share details. Then we do a very specific culture orientated survey online with a decent chunk of people in the business. And then finally, the third part is we use focus groups to discuss those points. Now, because now what we're doing is we're living engagement, or perhaps more importantly, we're living elements of the culture that the business wants to see. So if you want people to be involved, involve them. If you want to get people to share their ideas, create a space where they will share them. And then when you've got the data from the employees from business, then you can act on it. So I hope that to some degree kind of answers the point about is it top down or is it top down or bottom up? Look, it needs to be both, and somewhere in the middle we meet. But what I think has been fascinating the last year or two, and this is a bit of a bugbear of mine, so just let me climb on my soapbox just for 30 seconds, is a lot of HR divisions or HR functions are rebranding themselves as people in culture. And I think it's nonsense. HR is about HR processes, about hiring, it's about firing, it's about dismissals, and it's about form filling. If you're busy form filling, that has nothing to do with culture, nothing to do with it at all, and it bugs me. So a big question is, who owns culture in business? Perhaps we could discuss that one. Who owns culture in business?
I think it's a valid remark. HR. Should they own culture? I don't think so, personally, but it depends on the person, of course. Culture is something that's embedded into you. You have that passion, that dynamic. And to be honest, most HRs, what I've seen, they're really good in their job. Let's not underestimate them. They're really good at their job, but culture is something else. Culture is really something else. I always would suggest that you have someone who's really specialized in culture, possibly with a psychology background or something like that. Hey, Dan, you had a question or a remark or a contribution.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting what PJ was saying about, these people, choosing objectives because, there's a figure to be pursued, right? I think there's a lot of tendencies nowadays to confuse the KPIs with the actual goal, right? And if your ultimate goal is good work or good service or a good product, then that is, if that's really true, then it's expressed by good figures, right? But where there's a tendency to work the other way around and pursue the figures, whether you get there with good work, poor work, or even cheating, right? And that's that's something that's not positive, and especially when you get to the last part, the cheating, which is done a lot, by the way, much more than we think. Just, changing the figures, presenting things nicely, getting things out of presentations that didn't work very well, all that kind of hiding and gliding is very damaging for the corporate culture.
Correct. Hey, I'm conscious of time. And by the way, guys, I'm conscious of time. So generally we extend these meetings till max 45 minutes because people are with lunch. I want to open the floor a little bit because I want to give the other people the opportunity to ask some questions or contributions if they want. If you want, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask a question or contribute.
Will I go again?
Oh, Bernie.
The mute button there. No, thank you. And if you had something, Dan, do go for it. But I was going to maybe change direction a little bit. So I think a lot of the discussion so far was taking a corporate perspective culture. And I come from the startup and scale-up perspective. So it's a little bit different. Some of the things you were talking about, for example, that would have been different, that idea of gifts that you were talking about, things you could pull out from ideas from people. One of the suggestions was you can kind of have them in your back pocket, maybe put them aside for a month or two, look at them in the future. That's the kind of thing that might not well work in a startup or scale up because things change so fast and ideas probably relevant for the moment. and talking about who owns culture as well. And in a true startup-based sort of business of fewer than 100 people or so, it will be the CEO for a while. It needs to be handed off, of course, and so you grow. But it is maybe a simpler question. So I was wondering, to get the panel's perspectives on what things you might have said you'd see as different in that kind of space. Let's talk about maybe kind of businesses of 100 to 500 people and kind of the process of growing from one scale to the next there.
Can I go with that, Rahim, just for a moment?
Of course.
So where I see, Bernie, thanks, where I see it, just culture, let's just say, starts to come into the conversation. It may not be, they may not use that word, by the way, but just let's call it the notion of culture. You know, in startup, everything's going well, it's excited. Usually people are bought in. So that is the culture. It's a culture of excitement. But there may not be particularly efficient processes, and there may not need to be if there's just a dozen of you. When you start getting in the 20s or 30s for staff, maybe 40 people, that's when I first might get the conversation from a CEO or, you know, someone similar to say, listen, there's nothing wrong with our business, but something's not quite right. Right, you may get that one, or somebody will say, listen, we've spent a few years getting to 30, 40 people, but now we're about to go into a faster growth phase, or perhaps we're going to go into a slightly more mature phase. We're going to go from 40 to perhaps 100 people, and what we want to is we want to make sure we've kept our good stuff. And often they mean the culture stuff. They mean the way that, you know, decisions are made, the way that communication is shared. But that's not always easy. You know, you could share, everybody knew everything when there was 20 people. When there's 120 people, chances are everybody doesn't know everything. And that's when you have to put in processes. But the challenge then is those processes perhaps take away some of the naturalness. I'm not sure that's the word, you know, but the nature of the startup. And so, you know, you're going to go through these different phases. So I think probably that's the one to watch, is the natural growth phase, where you've gone from 20 people to 120 people. Things kind of have to change. But just, I always think it's really important to try and not hang on to, but make a note of, define what you really enjoy about that space. And how you kind of want to keep doing things. Because if you quickly look at, say, something like, does anybody eat Kind bars, you know, healthy bars, sort of nutty bars? Everybody know the brand Kind? You know, I mean, great brand in the States, you know, fast startup. 6 days for them, you know, making a decision in 6 days, for example, you know, that's a long time, just to give an idea. But they were bought by Mars, and Mars, 6 weeks is quick. So how do you move those two cultures? Perhaps that's not, I don't know, Bernie, if that's helpful, but how do you engage those two things? How do you, if you acquire an entrepreneurial brand like Kind, how do you allow it to move so fast when something like, and this is just a question, when Mars structures might be slower? Bernie, what do you think?
I think it's very relevant, especially when you're combining cultures, as per your example there. That is a challenge, and one that should probably be considered before the acquisition. There's many, many cases where very effective small businesses are destroyed by the parent because of imposition of culture and other processes. I mean, maybe more organic. You highlight things to watch for there, but what should you do about them alongside both? Like, you take an example of the CEO owning the culture 1 minute, and then it's at the point where they can't do that. They don't have the time, they don't know everyone, they can't actually have their finger on the pulse as they did previously. How would you transition it to someone else owning that culture? And what kind of processes would you put in place?
Yeah, great one. I think the if you can, the key here is to document, understand your current culture and document it. Have conversations with people. That's what we do for businesses. Have the individual conversations. What works well here? You know, what do you like about this business? How do you like to behave? Tell us about, you know, don't use words like agile. What does it really mean? How do you really feel about it? Document it, and then look at how those things actually happen. For example, there's 3 people involved in a decision, not 33, and just notice how you like that. Just because the business grows doesn't mean you then have to have a meeting with 30 people, and just because they've all got titles of management or manager, or you don't have to, you don't have to do that. and try and keep it, or if not keep all of it, keep the bits that really matter to you, that make you unique, because as you know, that's what's going to make you special. That's what customers are going to like. And actually often what, to your point, that's what buyers often like, as in buyers of the business, acquirers, and then I wouldn't say ruin it, but then don't necessarily pay respect to it. And I worked with a guy a number of years ago, Philip White, an amazing guy actually, but he spent 9-12 months understanding his business prior to it being acquired so that he could choose the acquirer. And I think he got 10 or 12 expressions of interest, 8 of which were genuine. From there, he selected the buyer that he felt would best fit their future growth, would allow his business to maintain its, not so its independence, but its culture. And years on, it has been very, very, very successful. I think it was one of the fastest sort of fintech acquisitions in the UK of the time. But his people went on to flourish. And I think that's a testament to his investment, actually.
So Bernie, maybe to add, to chime into this one, because we were talking about takeovers. A lot of really cool startups, even when they're not profitable, large corporates have a challenge. They struggle with innovation. They're stuck in their processes. They're stuck in their mindset, thinking, etc., etc. So when they buy organizations, they often not just buy them for the products, or maybe they do because you're in a market they can't reach, but often they buy them for the dynamic. And it's really, really, really important that when you decide to sell your company, and for me, if in my company, if I would sell my company, I would not sell my company to anyone. I don't sell it for the money. I will sell my company because I want my company to flourish in the future. So that match of who buys me, who buys my company, who's going to work with my team members that care. What you see often in startups, people come in with a belief, something cool, something new, something dynamic, and then they get chucked up by the bigger monster, and it ends. People get disturbed. They get too many processes, or the structure is not there. So it's always what I always suggest when we work with M&As and we help equities buy companies. We critically really need to look at effectively that culture of the organization. How can we save that? Because if you get bought, generally, if it's an private equity, they want to invest in you 4 years. They want to have a certain EBITDA so they can sell you again. But the moment they kill the culture of the organization, and I'm not saying putting processes in place, I'm not saying improving stuff, I'm not saying changing stuff, but if they break the culture, the dynamic of the organization, basically they lose their investments. And that's the thing they often forget. They just think we buy them, we absorb them, and we go for it. In most engagements, we do see, yeah, you're bought, but let the company be the company for at least a year. Let's look at their culture. Let's look at the dynamic. Let's look at where they're really good at. And the right company who buys your company, or the right company, or yourself, by the way, if you grow, the only way of maintaining that positive vibe is to make sure that your culture, that dynamic, the things you do good, continue. I always say, what are we going to stop? What are we going to continue? And where are we going to excel? And those are the questions I generally ask, because sometimes we hold on old-fashioned processes. We're managing that monster because we're afraid to let go. We have to let go of certain things to be able to move forward.
Yeah, I do agree. I think the corporates that I've seen doing acquisitions, looking at startups, even looking at founding their own internal startups, are getting better at this. PE I've seen far less. I mean, PE, when they buy something, there tends to be a thesis for the future they want to achieve that will let them sell it on. And then they want to get from A to B as quickly as possible. And culture, I've not seen come into it all that often. So, yeah, I mean, these are very important considerations. Certainly agree. There's a long way to go to have more successful acquisitions in general.
But no, agreed, Bernie. And just, I mean, just as a an example, Rahim, just from, what you were saying about the acquisitions and the culture piece. You buy something and it works, and then you sort of trash the culture almost. But look over the last few years, for example, and I don't have all the numbers on this, but just bear with me for a minute. If you think the last few years, they're probably 80 global banks, 80 major banks, let's say globally. Some of which had, a reasonable digital presence or platform, and many didn't. And some tried to, improve their, or improve their digitization of the digital platforms internally, and others went externally to, to buy, cool, funky brands and bring them in and integrate them into their business so that they could buy the skills, the knowledge, they could buy the agility, the innovation, and so on. They went out and did that. And some of those businesses that they acquired barely lasted 3 months, before they were swallowed. And yet the banks think, these are big old-fashioned banks, you might say, but they wanted the product, they wanted the staff, they wanted the skills, they wanted the elements, but it was very, very hard for them to integrate, primarily because of that monstrous culture clash. And I think so. There's at least 2 cultures going to be involved, maybe even more than that when you come into a bank. But it's not an easy thing to do. Get it right, it's absolutely amazing. But I don't think, to your point, that enough people give it due consideration up front. And if you're the leader of one of those businesses, and your perhaps idea was to make as much money as you can, then maybe selling it and leaving after 3-6 months and going to start up again, might have been your plan all along. I don't know.
Yeah. Hey, Katrina, I know you guys are in the car. Do you want to add something?
I think you're right. Corporate culture is important. Who owns it? Who drives it? My husband is actually a HR consultant. So when it was said HR is not responsible, he did actually mention that the understanding of what HR is was maybe a little skewed. So I'll let him comment on that.
Hey, Simon.
Hi, how are you doing? Your perception of HR was fundamentally flawed. Yeah, that concerns me because it's what you were describing was old-fashioned 1970s personnel management. Human resource management is entirely different from what you said. And maybe I should say, just as a little introduction or background about myself, I have a master's degree in the subject. I'm a fellow of the Chartered Institute, so I'm qualified to know about the subject.
Simon, thank you. And just I like to say that as a provocative point, right? And there is, quite rightly, please listen. There's a huge continuum of skills and understanding, but I think nonetheless we have this piece where, and you just say there's still a lot of that old-fashioned, HR nest, policies, procedures, and I see people really struggle. So a number of clients I worked with last couple of years, HR are busy doing HR stuff, but the notion of just rebranding, I don't know how you feel about it, clearly with with your experience, but just rebranding it for me doesn't make it so. And I always welcome the conversation. I don't think HR can own culture. I think it's a really interesting conversation around that, who does. But some of the HR directors I've seen, or HR departments I've seen recently, they're so busy off the back of COVID trying to manage day-to-day workloads, if you like, that they cannot take on this new, let's call it, project called culture. What do you think?
I think we tend to work with smaller organisations. So at the moment, we're both working with an organisation that's going through rapid growth. I'm helping them. They didn't have a mission. They didn't have a vision. So I'm helping them on business strategy side and marketing strategy side. And Simon's actually been working with them because 6 months ago, they'd only got 3 people in the company. Now they've got 10, 11. They're continually recruiting. They identified that they needed to have a culture, and Simon's been working with them on that because they admitted they didn't know how to engage, how to bring the team along with them. We'd got two entrepreneurs that had never worked in other organizations, so were totally lost, knew that they needed to do something, and maybe they got to that point a lot earlier than the 100 people mark, but they didn't know how to go forward. And for them, they saw it as being not a marketing-led thing, but a HR-led thing. They hadn't thought about bringing a third party on for that, because Simon's been putting in HR processes as well. And he hasn't started that bit yet. He's only been working on culture and getting to know the team so that there's trust built up. We've only been working with them a few weeks. Si?
Is there a question there?
No, have you got any further comments?
That organisation psychology is a discipline which comes under human resource management, and it may well be the case that there are people, organisations who have rebranded their old-fashioned personnel management department to HR, whilst not really understanding the subject and not really therefore practicing what they are supposed to be doing. That's true. That's life. But if we get into the best practice, or even if we looked at academia on the subject of organization psychology and human resource management, I think that's where the topic of organizational culture does sit and should sit rightly, and the textbooks would support that as well as the case studies.
Yeah, you tend to talk a lot with our clients about the psychological contract, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the psychological contract is important, and not a lot of. It comes back to your point that there are so-called HR departments who probably haven't even heard of the psychological contract, let alone are concerned with it. So,
Simon, I don't suppose you've got your camera on, have you, Simon? Or could you see us? Because when you started talking about that psychological contract, no, there were just lots of smiles. That was all. I don't know if you could see that, but
hey Simon and Katrina, may I suggest the following? Can we have a chat later when you guys have time? Contact Wendy, or Wendy will contact you. Because I think we have a really interesting topic for one of our next Lunch and Learns. This will actually also drive some benefit for our audience, for the people who like to learn more. I think this is actually quite an interesting topic. So let's park this one for now, and let's have a conversation in the next few weeks to see if this is a topic we could explore to having a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would really like that.
And we'll sort something out.
Hey Burhan, you are the last one on our list. Do you have anything you want to share from your perspective? Okay, Burhan is still mute, so I'm guessing you don't have more questions. Hey guys, we are a bit over time, and I think this was actually an amazing conversation. Honestly, I learned a lot. I'm really happy with the contribution of all of you guys on the phone, joining us. I think we may be really blessed to having you guys as part of this conversation. I hope you guys liked it. I hope you guys loved it. If you didn't love it or like it, let me know, because we're always open to learn more about how we can improve these sessions. I think for this session, it was amazing. PJ, as always, I love you, bro.